For centuries, the Dacians have lived somewhere between legend and historical footnote, overshadowed by the grandeur of Rome and forgotten in many mainstream histories of Europe. They've been cast as mysterious tribes who simply disappeared after the Roman conquest. But what if that wasn't the end of their story? What if science, specifically cutting-edge genetic research, is now proving that the Dacians never truly vanished, and that their legacy flows in the veins of millions of modern Europeans today? In a series of groundbreaking studies, geneticists have begun to uncover the deep ancestry of the Dacian people, using ancient DNA extracted from burial sites across modern-day Romania and neighboring regions. The findings are nothing short of stunning. Not only do they confirm the Dacians were a distinct and richly mixed population, but they also show how their genetic signature survived the upheavals of empire, migration, and time itself. Far from being lost, the Dacians are being rediscovered in data, in genomes, and in the quiet persistence of their bloodlines. This video isn't just about ancient people and dusty ruins. It's about how science can challenge the way we view our past, and how the Dacians, once considered a forgotten people, are emerging as key players in the story of Europe's genetic and cultural evolution. You'll learn how archaeologists, historians, and geneticists are piecing together a forgotten identity, and how the echoes of Dacia still live on today in ways most of us never imagined. So buckle in, we're about to travel thousands of years into the past, with the help of science, to meet a people whose story is only just beginning to be told. This is the genetic awakening of the Dacians. For much of history, the Dacians were little more than a shadowy presence in ancient records. Roman historians like Dio Cassius and Trajan's column in Rome painted them as fierce, wild warriors, worthy foes who resisted Roman conquest longer than most. But outside of their final battles and their defeat, little was understood about who the Dacians truly were. Today, through archaeology and now genetics, we are beginning to see a much fuller, richer picture. The Dacians lived primarily in what is now modern Romania and parts of surrounding countries, thriving between roughly 500 BCE and 100 CE. Their heartland was a mountainous, heavily forested region that provided natural defenses and isolated them from some of the larger empires of the time. Far from being simple tribesmen, the Dacians built complex fortified cities known as Davi, constructed sophisticated religious sanctuaries, and developed distinct artistic styles, especially in metalwork. Their craftsmanship in gold, silver, and iron rivaled anything produced by their Mediterranean contemporaries. Linguistically, the Dacians spoke a language that was Indo-European but distinct, likely related to Thracian, and perhaps even sharing distant roots with modern Albanian, though this is still debated among scholars. Their religious practices revolved around a supreme god, Zalmoxis, and many ancient writers commented on the Dacians' intense spirituality and belief in the immortality of the soul. Politically, the Dacians managed to unite under powerful kings like Burbista and Decebalus, leaders who consolidated smaller tribes into a formidable state. Under Decebalus especially, the Dacians became a true regional power, strong enough to negotiate with and repeatedly defy the mighty Roman Empire until Emperor Trajan launched a full-scale invasion in the early 2nd century CE. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Dacians is how they straddled worlds. They were not fully part of the classical Mediterranean sphere, yet they were deeply connected to it through trade, warfare, and cultural exchange. Greek goods have been found in Dacian sites, as have Roman artifacts, suggesting that while the Dacians fought these civilizations, they also interacted with and borrowed from them. What truly sets the Dacians apart, however, was their resilience. Even after the Roman conquest, Dacian traditions did not simply vanish. Roman Dacia became one of the most militarized and Romanized provinces, but the genetic and cultural imprints of the native Dacians endured beneath the Roman veneer. And now, with ancient DNA analysis, we can begin to see just how much of the Dacian population survived, adapted, and continued influencing the region long after Rome itself fell. In short, the Dacians were far more than a conquered people. They were a complex, vibrant civilization at the crossroads of Europe, whose story is only now being fully uncovered. Thanks to a new partnership between archaeology and genetics, The Dacians are stepping out of the mists of legend and taking their rightful place in the grand mosaic of European history. For centuries, what we knew about the Dacians came mostly from ancient texts and artifacts. But today, thanks to advancements in ancient DNA technology, we are now able to look beneath the surface, literally. Scientists have begun sequencing the genomes of skeletal remains found in what was once Dacian territory, and what they're uncovering is transforming our understanding of who these people were and where they came from. Ancient DNA, or ADNA, is extracted from human remains like bones and teeth, often found in burial sites. For the Dacians, several key excavation sites in Romania and neighboring regions have yielded well-preserved remains. From these, researchers have isolated genetic material that has been locked away for nearly 2 millennia. Using cutting-edge sequencing technologies, these fragments have been pieced together to form a genetic blueprint of the ancient Dacian population. So what does the Dacian genome tell us? For starters, it confirms that the Dacians were a genetically mixed group. Their DNA shows a blend of 3 major ancestral sources: Western European hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers from the Near East, and steppe pastoralists linked to the Indo-European migrations. This mixture aligns with what geneticists call the tripartite model of European ancestry, a mosaic of populations that moved and mingled over thousands of years. What makes the Dacians particularly interesting is the balance of these components. While much of Central and Western Europe leaned heavily toward Neolithic and steppe ancestry by the time of the Iron Age, Dacian samples show a surprisingly strong local Mesolithic component. This suggests that the region may have retained more of its indigenous hunter-gatherer ancestry than previously believed, making it a genetic time capsule of sorts, a place where older European lineages persisted longer than elsewhere. Another fascinating find is the presence of certain unique genetic markers that link the Dacians to neighboring Thracian and Illyrian groups. These markers help confirm that there were genetic as well as cultural connections across the Balkans, reinforcing the idea that the Dacians were part of a larger, loosely connected family of tribes. Additionally, minor traces of Anatolian and even Iranian-related ancestry hint at more distant contacts through trade or ancient migrations, possibly from Bronze Age movements that predate the Dacians themselves. Importantly, these genetic findings also show continuity into the Roman period. Although the Romans settled large numbers of people in the province of Dacia, the core population retained a substantial amount of pre-conquest DNA. This directly challenges older theories that the Dacians were wiped out or completely assimilated. Instead, the genetics show that the locals adapted and endured, blending with newcomers, but keeping their own legacy alive in the process. As more Dacian genomes are sequenced in the coming years, we'll likely learn even more about the regional variations within Dacia, their social structures, and even their health and diets. For now, ancient DNA has done something remarkable. It has brought the Dacians to life in a way that no ancient scroll or sword ever could. Through their genes, these forgotten people are telling their story loud and clear. The Dacians weren't born out of one single migration or ancestral group. They were a living, breathing mosaic woven together over thousands of years. If the ancient world was a crossroads, then Dacia was one of its busiest intersections. The region absorbed waves of people, ideas, and genes. The result? A population that was as complex as the rugged terrain they inhabited. Recent genetic studies are now giving us a clearer picture of how 3 major ancestral threads, steppe, Balkan, and Thracian, came together to shape the Dacian identity. Let's begin with the steppe influence. Around 3000 BCE, pastoralist tribes from the Pontic-Caspian steppe surged across Europe. These were the Amnea, a group believed to have introduced Indo-European languages. Their genetic signature, marked by a specific Y-DNA haplogroup known as R1b, swept across the continent. In Dacian remains, this steppe ancestry is clearly visible. It didn't completely dominate the local gene pool, but it blended with it. These steppe genes are linked not only to physical traits like height and facial structure, but also to cultural shifts. Horse domestication, burial practices, and possibly warrior customs that echo later in Dacian society. But Dacia wasn't an empty canvas when the steppe herders arrived. The Balkans had already been home to Neolithic farmers and Mesolithic hunter-gatherers for thousands of years. These early populations had their own distinct genetic signatures, often linked to mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child. In Dacian samples, we see a surprisingly high retention of this Balkan ancestry, proof that the older population didn't vanish, but merged with newcomers. This ancient Balkan thread gives the Dacians a deep continuity with the land they lived on, connecting them genetically to some of Europe's oldest farming communities. Then there's the Thracian connection. The Thracians were a collection of tribes living just to the south of Dacia, in parts of modern-day Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. They shared linguistic, religious, and artistic traits with the Dacians, but until recently, we weren't sure how close they were genetically. Ancient DNA now reveals a strong overlap between Dacian and Thracian genomes, enough to suggest that these were not just neighbors, but kin. Both groups carry a mix of steppe and Balkan genes, but the proportions differ slightly. Some Dacians, especially those near the southern border, show almost identical genetic profiles to Thracian individuals. This suggests regular intermarriage, shared ancestry, and possibly even shifting tribal identities between the two. The genetic story also hints at smaller, less expected influences. There are minor traces of Anatolian and even Caucasus ancestry, perhaps relics from ancient trade routes or refugee populations that settled over time. These are faint echoes, but they show how porous Dacia's borders really were. In the end, the Dacians weren't a static or pure people. They were dynamic and evolving. Their DNA reveals a blend of powerful steppe bloodlines, rooted Balkan continuity, and close Thracian kinship. They were both a product of their land and a reflection of the wider ancient world. In understanding this mosaic, we don't just learn about Dacia. We learn how ancient Europe itself was formed, not by isolation, but by constant movement, mixing, and exchange. When Rome marched into Dacia in 106 CE, it wasn't just a clash of empires. It was a collision of worlds. The Roman conquest of Dacia under Emperor Trajan is one of the most well-documented military campaigns of the ancient world, celebrated in the intricate carvings of Trajan's column in Rome. But beyond the battles, fortresses, and legions, something even more lasting took place: the biological blending of two very different populations. And today, through the lens of DNA, we're finally beginning to understand how this encounter shaped the genetic map of the region. Before the Romans arrived, the Dacians were already a culturally and genetically diverse group. As we've seen, their ancestry was a mix of Balkan, steppe, and Thracian influences. But the Roman conquest marked a turning point, a moment when the genetic makeup of the region began to shift dramatically. The Roman Empire didn't just conquer by sword. It colonized by settling soldiers, artisans, and administrators in the lands it subdued. Dacia was no exception. After the conquest, the Romans established new cities, roads, and mining operations. Along with them came people from every corner of the empire. Italians from the Apennine Peninsula, Gauls from what is now France, Iberians from Spain, Greeks from the Aegean coast, and even North Africans and Syrians. Genetic data from post-conquest Dacian graves reveals an influx of foreign DNA, markers associated with Southern Europe and the Mediterranean, which were largely absent in pre-Roman Dacian samples. This genetic infusion didn't wipe out the Dacian lineage, but it did dilute and diversify it. Over time, local Dacians intermarried with Roman settlers, resulting in a new hybrid population. These genetic exchanges weren't always peaceful. Some came through coercion, slavery, or political control, but they were widespread and enduring. Archaeological findings even show that many Roman soldiers retired in Dacia, married local women, and passed down both their genes and their customs to the next generation. Interestingly, this Roman-Dacian fusion helped lay the foundation for modern Romanian identity. Even though the Romans withdrew from Dacia around 271 CE due to military pressures, the genetic and cultural legacy of their occupation endured. Latin continued to influence the language. Roman customs shaped local practices, and Roman genes became part of the region's biological makeup. Geneticists today can see clear evidence of this encounter. In the genomes of modern Romanians, there's a significant Mediterranean component, one that aligns with Italian, Iberian, and Balkan populations. These aren't distant echoes. They're proof of a deep, ancient mixing that began during the Roman occupation of Dacia. But it's not just about bloodlines. The genetic encounter between Dacians and Romans is also a story of cultural adaptation. Roman burial styles, pottery, clothing, and architecture blended with local traditions. Even after the empire left, its influence lived on in the people. So, while Trajan may have claimed victory through conquest, the real legacy of Rome and Dacia wasn't military. It was genetic. The Dacian-Roman encounter created a new, blended population, one whose DNA still whispers stories of empire, resistance, and transformation. The Dacians may have vanished as a political entity nearly 2,000 years ago, but their legacy didn't disappear. Instead, it took root quietly, deeply, and across generations, within the very DNA of modern populations. Through the lens of modern genetics, we now know that the Dacians never truly vanished. Their genetic fingerprints are still alive in the people of Romania and surrounding regions, hidden in chromosomes and quietly shaping the heritage of millions. Modern genetic studies in Eastern and Southeastern Europe show a fascinating continuity with ancient populations, including the Dacians. When researchers compare ancient DNA samples recovered from Dacian archaeological sites with DNA from contemporary Romanian populations, the connections are clear. There's a strong presence of shared genetic markers, especially in mitochondrial DNA, passed down from mothers, and autosomal DNA, which combines contributions from both parents, that suggest a significant portion of the ancient Dacian genome lives on. But this legacy isn't limited to Romania. Neighboring populations in Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, and Moldova also show traces of Dacian-related ancestry. This makes sense when you consider how borders have shifted over the centuries and how people have moved, mixed, and migrated. The genetic legacy of the Dacians transcends modern national lines, reminding us that ancient peoples were far more interconnected than we often assume. One particularly fascinating aspect is how Dacian heritage has persisted despite major invasions and migrations. After the Romans withdrew from Dacia, waves of Goths, Huns, Slavs, and others swept through the region. Later came the Ottomans, Hungarians, Austrians, and Russians. Each left some genetic imprint, but the core Dacian ancestry endured. It became part of a layered genetic story, not erased, but blended, like ancient bedrock beneath newer layers of cultural sediment. Even beyond genetics, Dacian heritage can be seen in cultural traditions, language roots, folklore, and even place names. Romanian, while a Romance language shaped by Latin, also carries substrate influences, fragments of vocabulary and syntax that may trace back to Dacian and Thracian tongues. Rural customs and ancient symbols carved into wood, pottery, and textiles also bear striking resemblance to those found at pre-Roman Dacian sites. However, it's the genetic continuity that gives the strongest and most tangible link to the past. Scientists often describe modern Romanian genomes as a unique mosaic, a blend of ancient Balkan, Dacian, Roman, Slavic, and other components. This rich tapestry isn't just a list of percentages. It's a living record of thousands of years of adaptation, resilience, and survival. Importantly, this legacy helps correct outdated narratives. The Dacians were long portrayed as a people lost to time, swallowed by Roman conquest. But DNA shows that they didn't disappear. They merged, endured, and evolved. Their descendants walk among us today, not only in Romania but across the region, carrying bits of ancient memory in every cell. So when we talk about Dacian legacy, we're not only talking about ruins and artifacts, we're talking about people. Living, breathing individuals who unknowingly carry forward one of Europe's oldest stories. That's the true power of genetics, to reconnect the past to the present in the most personal way imaginable. The story of the Dacians isn't just a local or regional tale. It's part of a much bigger narrative that reshapes how we understand the history of all of Europe. Thanks to advances in genetic research, especially ancient DNA analysis, the Dacians have become more than just a footnote in Roman history. They're now seen as a crucial puzzle piece in the vast and complex mosaic of ancient European peoples. And their genome is helping to rewrite what we thought we knew about Europe's early inhabitants. For a long time, much of European history was constructed through archaeology, historical texts, and linguistic studies. These methods gave us great insight, but also left gaps and sometimes led to misleading ideas, particularly the assumption that ancient populations were neat, separate groups, living in clear-cut territories with little mixing. DNA has demolished that old framework. The Dacians, as revealed by genetic research, are proof that Europe was always dynamic, fluid, and interconnected. Their genome shows a combination of Neolithic farmer ancestry, Indo-European steppe heritage, and local Mesolithic forager lines. This blend is not only genetically rich, it also tells us something profound about how ancient cultures formed. The Dacians weren't an isolated mountain tribe or a minor provincial group. They were part of the same broad waves of movement and interaction that shaped the entire continent. This changes how we look at the ancient European map. Instead of separate tribes moving around in strict order, we begin to see overlapping zones of influence, constant cultural exchanges, and intermarriage between neighbors and migrants. Dacia wasn't a fringe, it was a crossroads. This has important implications for how we define identity. For centuries, people in Europe and elsewhere have looked to ancient groups as symbols of national pride or origin stories. But genetics shows us that identity was never static. The Dacians themselves were not a pure people, but a mixture of older populations. And their legacy, in turn, has blended with many more since. The Dacian genome also repositions Eastern Europe in the historical narrative. Too often, ancient Eastern Europe has been overshadowed by the histories of Greece, Rome, and Western Europe. But the genetic evidence highlights the central role regions like Dacia played in shaping the genetic and cultural story of the continent. These lands were not backwaters. They were places where major movements converged and new identities were born. What's even more exciting is that the Dacians are just one example. As geneticists sequence more ancient DNA from burial sites across the continent, we're discovering that many so-called lost peoples are still with us, encoded in the genes of modern populations. This growing field is allowing us to uncover invisible histories, ones that were erased from texts or never written down at all. In short, Dacian DNA doesn't just tell us who they were, it tells us who we all are, or at least who we came from. It invites us to rethink Europe not as a patchwork of separate stories, but as a long, shared journey full of mingling, movement, and transformation. The story of the Dacians is far from over. In fact, it may just be beginning, thanks to the ever-expanding capabilities of genetic research. As technology evolves, so does our ability to reconstruct the past with greater precision and nuance. For the Dacians, whose legacy was long overshadowed by empires and erased by time, this is a powerful opportunity for rediscovery and redefinition. Future excavations and genomic studies promise to unearth more Dacian burial sites, allowing researchers to map not just who the Dacians were genetically, but how they lived, moved, married, traded, and adapted across centuries. High-resolution DNA analysis can now detect patterns across family lines, population shifts, and even trace specific ancestries through maternal and paternal markers. This means we're on the brink of being able to build detailed genetic maps that show the Dacians not as static people frozen in time, but as a vibrant, changing culture interacting with its environment and neighbors. At the same time, the implications for modern identity are profound. As Romanians, Moldovans, and others in the Balkans increasingly explore their roots, genetic data offers a shared point of connection, one that goes beyond myths or politics. It doesn't replace history or culture. It deepens both. DNA allows people today to understand that their heritage isn't based solely on language or borders, but on real, biological continuity with the ancient past. Ultimately, the future of Dacian identity lies in blending science with storytelling, giving voice to those long silent and placing their journey within the broader human saga. In the coming years, as labs decode more genomes and archaeology uncovers more secrets, the Dacians may finally step out of the shadows and take their rightful place as one of Europe's foundational peoples.